very much. And I want to say first that I'm very thankful for the experience of being here. Not for that little bit though, but anyway. Very thankful to be here, and extremely thankful that I was part of the Baliso trip, even though I didn't fare so well on the boat, but we won't speak too much about that. And I also wanted to say that I'm from the University of Toronto, but I'm from Barbados. I grew up there, so I'm from Barbados via Toronto. So I've set for myself the task, I'm going to speak for 25 minutes, and at 25 minutes I'm stopping. It does not matter where I am in the paper, and I will wrap up so that we can have time for discussion. And my paper today it's entitled Geographies of the Indigenous Hemispheric Perspectives on the Early Modern Lesser Antilles. And I just want to start with a very brief story. It's a story from a friend of mine who was an anthropologist. She was actually my roommate in graduate school in England. And she researched the anthropology of Rastas in Cuba. And at one point, she kind of had a crisis, as you always do when you're doing a dissertation, and she was worried about the importance of her research, whether it mattered, but she was also actually quite worried about the potential implications of the research that she was doing. And she confided these worries to a Rasta elder, a Cuban Rasta elder, her fear that people might use the research that she was doing to exploit people who she had that was not her intention in collecting the material that she was collecting. And he listened to her quite patiently, and when she was finished, he just told her, put his hand on her shoulder and said, just tell a story that helps. Right? And I always remember that as one of the reasons, I think, for doing history, and I offer this paper in this spirit, as an attempt to tell a story that helps. So the paper that this is part of is much longer than what I will present today, and I've reorganized it a bit to try to fit the time period, so I put the most important information first, and I'm going to emphasize the legal history aspects of this paper. There's other material in it that overlaps quite a bit with what Julie just presented, but I'm going to emphasize the legal history, because I think that's what's most relevant here. So this paper, as I said, as was mentioned earlier, is part of a larger project that traces the role of the indigenous as concept and lived experience in Anglophone Caribbean history, as well as the place of the Caribbean in shaping conceptions of the indigenous in the Atlantic world. And that larger project has a very long time span. It goes from the 16th century right up until 2006. There's a specific set of events in 2006 in Guyana, and I end there. But this paper focuses on the 16th to 18th centuries, and I examine how European colonists sought to write the indigenous people of the Caribbean archipelago out of colonial history, even as that history was unfolding. And the central argument of this paper is that Europeans in the early modern Americas constructed something of a mythical map of distinctions between what they viewed as an indigenous continent, in a sense, on one hand, so a continent with indigenous people and defined by an indigenous presence, and on the other hand, a Caribbean archipelago with an at best ephemeral indigenous presence on the other. Now, Lesser Antillean indigenous people forced Europeans to reckon with their presence, as happened elsewhere in continental America. And between the 1650s and 1660s, English and French colonial officials did begin to move towards a more realistic engagement with the Lesser Antilles as a place which, like the continent, was inhabited by Aboriginal people with whom treaties would have to be made. So they moved towards a policy of acknowledging indigenous sovereignty with treaties and legal agreements in the 1650s and 1660s. However, this new policy coincided with the rise of plantation slavery in the Lesser Antilles, and the rise specifically of the slave trade, which gave the English in particular an urgent motivation for once again denying the presence of Caribbean indigenous people. By the late 17th and 18th centuries, the English and the French both viewed legal treaties with Lesser Antillean indigenous people as an impediment to the rapid expansion of African slavery and sugar cultivation. And what they feared most was the presence of people or communities of both African and indigenous ancestry. And the French and the British used this fact of the combined African and indigenous ancestry of indigenous communities in the Lesser Antilles as a quasi-legal grounds for dismissing the notion that they were really Aboriginal people. And both French and British colonists, but particularly the English in the Lesser Antilles, beginning in the late 17th and early 18th centuries, systematically suppressed information that traveled between the Lesser Antilles, Paris, and then to Paris and London, about the presence of indigenous people in the Lesser Antilles, claiming that the quote-unquote real Caribs had all but disappeared, leaving their lands available to be fought over by rival European claimants. And this is part of the wider consolidation of racist thought in the colonial Americas and the systematic denial that happens elsewhere in the Americas as well of the indigenous claims of people who are of both Aboriginal and African descent. And it's part of the creation of sort of myths of racial taxonomy that suggested that a mixture of a person, of someone who is of European and Aboriginal American descent could be, quote unquote, an Indian, but someone who is of African and indigenous descent could not. They were. Okay, I'm assuming that's nothing to do with me. Okay, now the focus of this paper, the immediate focus, is actually a very specific legal document, which is something called the Royal Proclamation of October 7th, 1763. So it was issued on October 7th, 1763 by King George III of Great Britain. Now, the proclamation is a fundamental document in the legal history of relationships between Indigenous people and representatives of Crown authority in Canada. And it's incorporated into the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms. It's impossible to overstate the importance of this document. It is the basis of the contemporary legal rights of sovereignty that Indigenous people claim in Canada, in Ontario and Quebec, in relation to the federal government. So it's very, very important. The principal aim of the Royal Proclamation was to restore peace in the Great Lakes, Illinois, and Ohio regions, so this is in North America, in the aftermath of the 7 Years' War of 1756 to 1763. Now that war was supposed to have been settled by a peace treaty signed in February 1763, and that peace treaty, the Paris Treaty, confirmed British dominance in the Atlantic world. However, that treaty made no mention of the sovereignty of Aboriginal peoples who had also fought in the 7 Years' War. The absence of any references to Indigenous Americans in the treaty helped to spark Pontiac's War, which was an Indigenous uprising in the Great Lakes, Illinois, and Ohio regions in May of 1763. So the Royal Proclamation was passed in response to Pontiac's War, and the Royal Proclamation created a land border between the territories of British colonists and Indigenous North Americans. So it actually created a map, which you can find. You can find this map that sort of designated the territory, the physical territory of Indigenous people, and the physical territory of British colonists in North America. White colonists' opposition to the proclamation's supposed concessions to Aboriginal people was a factor that fed into the American Revolution. Now you're wondering, why is she talking about this Royal Proclamation? Well, according to conventional wisdom, the Royal Proclamation of 1763 is a North American document, and it is not significant for the history of the British Caribbean. And when I read it as part of this research project, I actually read it initially for comparative purposes. I remembered reading it as an undergraduate. Of course, you never saw it reproduced in full, which I think is quite significant. But I had read it, and I just read it for sort of comparative purposes. So it came as a huge surprise to me when I read it in its entirety to find that the Royal Proclamation does refer in great detail to several newly acquired British territories in the Lesser Antilles. So the proclamation follows on from Article 9 of the Treaty of Paris, which ceded what the proclamation called Grenada to the British. And it spelled out that Grenada referred to the island of that name, together with the Grenadines, and the islands of Dominica, St. Vincent, and Tobago. So in other words, all but what had previously been designated in the Treaty of Aix-la-Chapelle as neutral territories, neutral islands which the British and the French could not agree on. So Article 9 of the Treaty of Paris also gave the neutral island of St. Lucia, which had been captured by the British during the war, to the French, and it made no mention of Indigenous people in St. Lucia. So St. Lucia was not included in the Royal Proclamation. In addition to the 4 territories that made up Grenada, the Royal Proclamation confirmed British control over Quebec and East and West Florida. So Quebec, East and West Florida, which was already laid out in the Paris Treaty. Now, according to Anglo-Jamaican planter and late 18th century historian of the Caribbean, a fellow by the name of Brian Edwards, so Edwards was extremely critical of the Paris Treaty's legal integrity. And he argued that the 9th article of the Paris Treaty, which gave the French and the British full and perpetual sovereignty over these islands, had no legal basis because the Caribs were not mentioned once in the whole transaction, as if no such people existed. So the proclamation can be divided into 4 distinct themes. So the themes are descriptions of these newly acquired governments, empowerment of the colonists, many of whom were French or Spanish speaking, to have assemblies and make laws, regulations for the building of forts and maintenance of soldiers, and finally a set of clauses on the territorial rights of Aboriginal people. So these provisions for Aboriginal rights are the key sections on which contemporary Indigenous land claims in the Canadian provinces of Ontario and Quebec are based. And it is telling that these provisions, these Aboriginal sovereignty provisions, are the only ones in the entire proclamation that excluded Grenada. And these provisions protected Aboriginal people's rights to remain, I quote, unmolested and undisturbed in the possession of some such parts of our dominions and territories as, not having been ceded to or purchased by us, this is us being the British, are reserved for them, Indians, as their hunting grounds. So the proclamation sought to maintain imperial control over colonists' land acquisitions and limit the possibility of conflict with Indigenous people. So the proclamation made it illegal for any governor or commander-in-chief in any of our colonies of Quebec, East Florida, or West Florida to grant warrants of survey or pass any patents for lands beyond the bounds of their respective governments. So basically, a local governor or a local representative could not enter negotiations over land. That was a Crown prerogative. Only the Crown could negotiate with any designated representative of an Indigenous person. So this was a relationship between sovereign states. Right. So as far as the proclamation was concerned, there were no Indigenous people in the Lesser Antilles whose rights merited the consideration of the Crown, even though, as I will hopefully have time to lay out in this paper, it was not actually entirely clear at the time of the proclamation's passage in 1763, that either the French or the British had actually established a legal right to cede any of these neutral islands to each other, even by their own standards. Now, the reason why I think this is important is because of the contemporary significance of this proclamation. And what I lay out in this paper is a history whereby, a very long history, whereby there is a systematic effort in both in sort of discursive effort and legal effort to deny the sovereignty of Indigenous people in the Lesser Antilles for a number of reasons. But the most significant, I think, for the perspective of this paper is because of their African ancestry, because they have African ancestry. And in contemporary legal context, because this law is still in force, right? That fact, the fact that you denied people sovereignty to their land on the basis of racial ancestry, that certainly, and then first you pass laws that permitted that effectively stated this, and the silence regarding Aboriginal people in the Royal Proclamation, and then proceeded to carry out, as the British did in 1797, a process of ethnic cleansing and genocide that has continuing social and political consequences. That constitutes potentially the grounds for a legal case because the law is still in force, because the Royal Proclamation is still active law, right? So I'm not really going to have time to go through this history, but basically, even before the British and the French arrived in the Lesser Antilles, the Spanish had already sort of laid the ground for this assumption that, in essence, there was not a consistent consistent Aboriginal Indigenous presence in the Lesser Antilles. So Hernan Cortes, when he first went to Mexico in 1519, launches this discourse that distinguishes the civilizations of Mexico and Peru on the basis of what some scholars call monumental indigeneity. So these great builders, these people with a great building tradition who have a social hierarchy, which was somewhat familiar to the Spanish, which the Spanish felt somewhat comfortable with. So the Spanish depictions of the so-called Caribs of the Lesser Antilles as nomadic and non-hierarchical people positioned them almost immediately upon European arrival in the Americas within pre-existing Roman law traditions as legal vagabonds without legitimate territorial claims. So when European incursions into the Lesser Antilles began in the late 16th century with English and Dutch efforts to establish colonies in the Guyanas and the Lesser Antilles, you saw some of these same distinctions between the same assumptions that there is a consistent indigenous presence in the continent, but not so in these islands. You see this played out in the way that they describe their colonization efforts. So there's a long succession of documents in the colonial archives in the United Kingdom, for example, that describe the Guyanas as a place where colonization is a great idea because there is a settled indigenous population which will be a good labor force, which will work for the British for nothing, which of course is not quite how things turned out. And where, as they say, tobacco is got with far greater ease than in Virginia, the Bermudas, or any other place, by the labor only and pains of Indians, quote unquote. And in other places it is made with the great toil and labor of our own country people. So problematic as this language is, what it speaks to is a recognition of the presence of indigenous people in the Guyanas. Now, most European attempts at Guyana colonization from the 1590s through to the 1650s actually ended in complete failure because indigenous people either annihilated the Europeans or starved them out, right? Despite this pattern of failure, you continue to get this consistent discourse of constructing the Guyanas as a place with an indigenous population that would welcome Europeans. And imperial historians have tended to follow the tone of these 17th century records, acknowledging the important presence of indigenous people in the Guyanas while minimizing the historical role of lesser Antillean indigenous people. So how long have I been speaking? Sorry, how long have I? 10 minutes? Okay. So you can see some of these differences between the sort of assumption of the continent as an indigenous space and assumptions about the Lesser Antilles in the September 1625 patent, which was Charles I to Thomas Warner, who was the first English governor of the Caribbee Islands. And this was a patent for the colonization of St. Kitts, Nevis, Barbados, and Montserrat. So Warner's patent referred in passing to the importance of the natives' consent to an English presence, but in contrast to Guyana, there were no florid pronouncements about island people's usefulness as a labor force. The main legal consideration was the absence of a, I quote, Christian prince or state or potentate, end quote, with a prior claim, as well as the fact that Warner had already planted an English colony at St. Kitts. So these are the main legal considerations. And you can contrast this with the patent, which is the basis for this patent, the 1607 patent for the colonization of Virginia, right? And the colonization patent for Virginia has a lot of the same formulaic language, legal language, as the 1625 Caribbee Islands patent. What is different is that there's a long paragraph in the Virginia patent that lays out as a key basis for colonization that they're going to, Christianize the local population, make Christians of them, and there's extensive discussion of that. And there's none of that in the patent for the Lesser Antilles. Much of the legal language is exactly the same. But this whole section, that is a key legal basis in the Virginia context, and it's absent from the Caribbee Islands context. So we can only speculate about English motivations for continuing up until the 1650s to pursue what was often a suicidal policy of attempting to establish settlements in the Lesser Antilles without first entering any agreements with local people. And it seems that there was a pre-existing legal definition of the Lesser Antillians as Caribs and cannibals. And cannibal was actually a legal category in early modern European law. And this was a category, a way of thinking that was first developed by the Spanish, and it seems to have closed off the conceptual possibility for the English of a diplomatic relationship with the Caribs. So English policy apparently proceeded from a view of the Lesser Antilles as occupying a legal status in Roman law traditions of colonization, somewhere between that of a conquered land, whose inhabitants were de facto defeated people, and res nullius, or nobody's land. And this is never clearly laid out in English colonial documents, but I think you see it in another space, which is literature. So if you were to read Robinson Crusoe, right, from 1719, and I won't go into the story of Robinson Crusoe, but the key point about Robinson Crusoe is that the way that the story is structured, and it is set in the Lesser Antilles, the story is quite clear about this, right? So the subsequent career of the book Robinson Crusoe is quite interesting, but we can talk about that later. But Robinson Crusoe is quite clearly set in the Lesser Antilles, and it's clear in that text that indigenous people come from the continent. They come from the continent and they have their cannibal feasts on this island, but they don't live on this island. And I think Robinson Crusoe, more clearly possibly than any other text, lays out how the English imagined the Lesser Antilles. The text is written in 1719, but set about 1650. So almost everywhere, the English pursued this policy up until the 1650s, when a series of failed colonization attempts seems to have finally made them realize that this was basically suicide in most cases. So there's a brief period in the 1650s and 1660s when the English and the French do seek legal arrangements for the transfer of land with the people of the Lesser Antilles. So there's a significant treaty in 1659 to 1660, and then there's an agreement to purchase St. Lucia in 1663. Now, these are very problematic acknowledgements of rights. I mean, the whole purpose of this is to acquire land for colonization, right? But it is an acknowledgement that this is a relationship between sovereign people, so it's a significant transformation. Now, within a few years of these treaties having been passed, there's a very interesting comment. And I'm skipping over quite a bit of the paper here, but there's a very interesting comment that is made by the governor of Barbados in 1668. And he's referring to the 1663 treaty for the purchase of St. Lucia. So in 1668, he writes to London and says, just a few years later, actually that treaty is no longer of any legal relevance because there are no longer more than about, I think he says, 60 Caribs left in St. Lucia. So basically the people with whom we signed that treaty do not exist. He never says where they're supposed to have gone. He never says exactly why this has changed in 5 years. What's interesting is that if you track the history of the British slave trade, 1667 to 68, precisely that year, the trade had been in existence since 1562 when John Hawkins made a crossing to Santo Domingo with 362 Africans on board. So that's the first date of the English slave trade. But the year when the slave trade takes off is 1667 to 68. That's the moment when you begin to get the numbers of people entering the Lesser Antilles as enslaved people going into the thousands. And that's exactly the same year when all of a sudden you begin to hear these claims about the disappearance of people. And one of the key elements of the treaty for the purchase of St. Lucia so that treaty stipulated that the Caribs would return such Negroes as have formerly run away from Barbados, and they shall deliver them to His Excellency. And as for such as shall hereafter be fugitives from that or any other English island, upon their arrival here shall be immediately secured and surrendered to ye English as soon as required. So what is happening in this period, that's already a concern in 1663, but in 1668, that concern about the presence of Caribs as a possible impediment as a possible place for people to escape to from slavery, but also the concern that treaties and a system of treaty making, which is a slow process, treaty making is not convenient for plantation expansion. It may be a useful tool in other forms of colonization, but in the context of plantation expansion, treaties are a problem. And the English are no longer interested in having treaties with the indigenous people of the Lesser Antilles. So I think, have I been going? It's been 25 minutes. Sorry? 5 minutes? I don't want to bore anybody. Okay. Well, so, okay, I guess to sort of make my very last points very quickly. So what you get so it's in this context that you begin to see conversations about, again, to follow on from what Julie said, the Black Caribs, and a new kind of narrative, which is the narrative that, yes, there were true Caribs before, but they've all now died, and their place has been taken by these new people who are usurpers of the Carib tradition, but they're not really Caribs. So they don't actually have any legal claim to the land which they own, right? And I mean, we know where this story ends, but what is interesting is that in 1700, so this is 97 years before the exile of the so-called Black Caribs from St. Vincent, there is a letter, a French colonial official in the Lesser Antilles is asked by his superiors about the possibility of exiling these Caribs, these Black Caribs from St. Vincent. This is 1700. And he writes the following in response. So he says, in response to this, "It is not possible to be at all assured that there will be Carib support for the removal of the black Caribs, because there are a great many of these Negroes allied with some of the Caribs and who live together on good terms. And one ought not at all to absolutely rely on the specific word of these Caribs, who speak little, who take a long time to explain themselves, and who judge most cleverly what one desires them to say. What is certain, and what makes me believe that these Caribs will never consent to allow the French to land on their part of the leeward coast and to give them passage to penetrate to the windward side, is that all their greatest consideration is given to not letting anyone set foot on their island, neither the French nor any kind of person. It is a very steadfast sentiment that they prefer to see 2,000 Negroes settle in their island than to see disembarking here only 50 armed Frenchmen. So this Intendant Robert is his name, acknowledged that it was common opinion, presumably among colonists, that there was enmity among these two groups, but he remained highly circumspect about the reality of such clear distinctions between black and yellow and red Caribs. Now, first of all, I think this is significant because, first of all, it is 1700, and you already have this very clear construction or effort to construct a narrative that will justify exile. Right, and to justify, and the effort to construct these racial differentiations. But it clearly had to be constructed, because this Intendant Robert is himself, he reveals the uncertainty in this period about the reality of these sorts of distinctions. But I also think it's significant because it shows how long this discourse was sort of planned and constructed. This is a well thought out process. Right? It doesn't happen just in the late 18th century. It's a very long process of basically creating this idea that there are these clear distinctions between people and that these black Caribs are not indigenous people. Right? And we can talk about the shipwreck story. There's some very interesting elements in that shipwreck story that Julie also mentioned, which you hopefully will get to talk about in the question period, that show the British were very careful about how they told this story. And the dates shifted, but certain elements always remained the same, about carefully constructing this story so that the people who survived this shipwreck would all be African, particularly African men, right? But we'll talk about why that matters later. So anyhow, all of this to say that by the 18th century, in the years that lead up to, there's a treaty called Aix-la-Chapelle, there are several other treaties, but by the 18th century, the Lesser Antilles, when in Europe, in Paris and London, when people imagine the Caribbean, what they imagine are planters and slaves. And those are the people who they see in urban centers of Paris and London. There were 30,000 people of African descent living in London before the abolition of the British slave trade. So this is a real presence, right? They don't imagine Caribs, they don't imagine Aboriginal people, right? And there is a clear effort on the part of the British in particular to construct a language that will justify the removal of people. And you see this, I think, first, in a sense, this removal on paper in the silence on those key provisions of the Royal Proclamation about Lesser Antillean Indigenous people. So, thank you.